Welcome to Freedom for Wild Horses, Episode 2, Wild Horses at Risk of Extinction. If you'd like an explanation of some of the history and challenges our wild horses are facing on our public lands, this episode is for you. I'm your host, Carol Walker. Let's get started. Welcome to the Freedom for Wild Horses podcast, the place to find out about wild horses in the American West and what you can do to help them stay wild and free. If you love wildlife, wild horses, and the freedom that they stand for, this show is for you. I'm your host, Carol Walker. Let's get started. In 1971, Congress unanimously passed the Wild Free-Roaming Horses and Burros Act. President Nixon, upon signing the act, declared, "Wild horses and burros merit man's protection historically, for they are a living link with the days of the conquistadors, through the heroic times of the Western Indians and the pioneers, to our own day when the tonic of wildness seems all too scarce. More than that, they merit it as a matter of ecological right, as anyone knows who has ever stood awed at the indomitable spirit and sheer energy of a Mustang running free. I'm happy to take part in the effort to guarantee their future, and I salute particularly those determined young defenders of the wild horse who have helped give impetus to this effort." Congress finds and declares that wild free-roaming horses and burros are living symbols of the historic and pioneer spirit of the West, that they contribute to the diversity of life forms within the nation and enrich the lives of the American people, and that these horses and burros are fast disappearing from the American scene. It is the policy of Congress that wild free-roaming horses and burros shall be protected from capture, branding, harassment, or death. And to accomplish this, they are to be considered in the area where presently found as an integral part of the natural system of the public lands. It's amazing to think about today that the Wild Horse and Burro Act was passed unanimously in Congress, and how much support there was at that time. And once the act was passed, the Bureau of Land Management was the agency that was charged with managing wild horses. Wild horses and burros can currently be found on public lands in 10 western states: Arizona, California, Colorado, Idaho, Montana, Nevada, Oregon, Utah, Washington, and Wyoming. Most of the wild horses and burros are managed by the BLM on public lands, and the rest are managed by the Forest Service. At the time the act was passed, there were 303 wild horse herd areas on 47 million acres. But now only 177 herd management areas are where wild horses live, on only 27 million acres. The BLM states that they aired, and the 208 herd areas could not be managed for wild horses, with a long list of excuses. Everything from it wasn't completely BLM land, they had to do land swaps, there wasn't water, it was too difficult to manage them. It's just a long list of excuses why all this land was zeroed out and is no longer available for the use of wild horses. Currently, about 70,000 wild horses and burros roam on our public lands. The BLM has a national AML. That's an appropriate management level. And what they set that at as what the lands could bear and how many wild horses and burros could be on those public lands. And that AML level is 16,300 to 26,770. So it's a range. And that's nationally. So that means that's all the wild horses that they think we should have on 10 western states. And this is a very small number. And it's not the number that were found in a survey that was done 4 years after the 1971 Act passed, at that time, the survey found 45,000 wild horses and burros. So this is lower than the actual amount that was found at the time. And the BLM has been going on about how they really need to get down to AML. And they are obsessed with this. They think that AML is the Holy Grail. And if they get there, if they can just get there, then everything's going to be fine. So in 2019, they announced a plan called 5 Years to AML. The plan is to round up and remove 18,000 to 20,000 wild horses and burros each year. And that adds up to roughly 100,000 wild horses and burros. There aren't even that many on the range currently. This plan is so detrimental to wild horses and burros and to their future. Other aspects of the plan were to add more off-range corrals and more off-range pastures and add permanent sterilization once they are down to the AML that they want. They say, well, we're not going to devote many resources to doing birth control that keeps the numbers down on the range until we get to AML, because that's what we really need to do. So it's not about the good of the wild horse. It's not about preserving them on our public lands where they belong. It's about this number that the BLM has decided that the wild horses and burros need to be at. And the budget for this madness is going up and going up at a very alarming rate. So the BLM's wild horse and burro budget for 2019 was $80.5 million. In 2020, it was $101 million. In 2021, it was $115 million. In 2022, it was $137 million. And the projected budget for this year is $153 million. In 2022, the costs were $83 million for the holding costs of the wild horses and $12 million for roundups. This is absurd. And obviously, the more horses that are rounded up and removed, the holding costs are just going to escalate. And currently, they have not announced the new roundup schedule for the year. They only have one herd management area on the schedule for 2023. And the reason is a lot of these holding facilities are completely overloaded. I was told last year that there was a roundup in Wyoming in North Lander Complex that would have removed at least 1,000 horses. Was not going to occur because there's not enough room in the holding facilities. The holding facilities are overloaded, they're understaffed, and the costs are just going to continue to increase. There are currently 63,000 wild horses and burros in the holding facilities. Most of the off-range corrals and the off-range pastures are private, and the public's not allowed to visit. So we have no say, no oversight, no way to know if the horses are being mistreated. Once a year, they usually plan an hour or two at one private holding facility that the public can attend. But that's not enough to be able to oversee what's going on and what's happening to the horses. There are 18 off-range corrals that do wild horse adoptions. Plus, there's an online adoption system about every 6 weeks. So as of January 2023, there are 22,505 wild horses and burros in off-range corrals. In the off-range pastures, there are 39,325 wild horses. And there are public off-range facilities that have 1,209 wild horses and burros. At the end of this year, there will most likely be more horses in holding facilities than there are in the wild. You've got to be thinking about that for a minute. More wild horses, more burros in holding facilities than in the wild. When the BLM has been mandated to manage wild horses in their homes on the range where they're found. The wild horses in off-range corrals are warehoused into crowded feedlot conditions, and these breed death and disease. For example, the facility in Canyon City at the prison in Colorado had an outbreak, and it was viral and bacterial, and 145 horses died in 2.5 months. These horses have not been exposed to these diseases in the wild. In the wild, they're healthy, they're thriving, they live out their lives. Then they get rounded up and removed and put into these facilities in crowded conditions. The horses are incredibly stressed because they lost their families. They're kept captive in these pens with horses they don't know. And they are exposed to diseases that can be in the ground, and they have no immunity. And it is a very sad thing to think about all of these horses that are captive, and they are no longer wild, and they are helpless against disease and death in these facilities. The off-range pastures are actually, just like they sound, they're pastures that the horses are in. They separate out, even though the stallions have been gelded, they separate out mares in some pastures and geldings in another. And they're in many states, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, different states, and they are continually asking for more contracts to put more horses in these facilities. The cost of putting a horse in an off-range pasture is less than in an off-range corral because the pastures often have lots of grass and they don't have to do supplemental feeding. But there's no guarantee of where the horses are going to end up. Remember when I told you that the Act states that it's the policy of Congress that wild free-roaming horses and burros shall be protected from capture, branding, harassment, or death? Well, they're not. The BLM captures them, brands them, harasses them, and kills them in their roundups. And this is what this agency that is supposed to protect them and manage them does to our wild horses. A very small percentage of the wild horses that are rounded up are actually adopted, but the vast majority will live out their lives in off-range corrals and off-range pastures at a huge taxpayer expense. The BLM says they've had adoptions of 240,000 wild horses and burros since the program started in 1971. And that sounds wonderful on the surface, but I've heard it could be up to 50% of these horses that are adopted have been returned to the BLM, and many end up at slaughter auctions. So this is not a guarantee of safety for wild horses. And then the wild horses that are over 10 or who have gone through 3 adoptions without being adopted, they can be sold without limitation due to the Burns Amendment in 2004. So that means that anyone can purchase these horses, and they don't have to wait a year to get the contract, to get the title for the horses. They can go ahead and turn around and sell them at a slaughter auction right away. So there is really no protection at all for the horses that are over 10 or have 3 strikes against them. A big question, why the roundups? Why are wild horses and burros being rounded up and taken from their homes, taken from their families, and put in these holding facilities? Well, the big answer is pressure from powerful special interest groups, such as the livestock lobby. They see the horses as competition for their cattle and sheep grazing on our public lands. They think that wild horses should go. They want all of the grazing for their cattle. To celebrate the launch of the show, I'm going to be giving away a 12-inch by 18-inch metal print of Blue Zeus called Into the Blue and 2 signed copies of my book, Blue Zeus, Legend of the Red Desert. I'm going to be giving them away to 3 lucky listeners who follow, rate, and review the show. Now, it doesn't have to be a 5-star review, although I sure hope you love the show. I really want your honest feedback so I can create an awesome show that provides tons of value. Visit www.wildhoofbeats.com/podcast launch to learn more about the contest and how to enter. I'll be announcing the winners on the show in episode 10. Thank you for listening to this episode of Freedom for Wild Horses. If you want to learn more, follow me at www.wildhoofbeats.com for more information and for ways to help America's wild horses. See you next time.